The clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute is supposed to be the happiest sound you hear on your wedding day. It means a toast is coming. It means people who love you are about to stand up, raise a glass, and say nice things about you and the woman you are about to spend the rest of your life with. I was sitting next to my beautiful wife, Zoe, in a ballroom that smelled like expensive white roses and roasted prime rib. The room was packed with 200 guests. The lighting was perfectly dim. The string quartet had just finished their dinner set. Everything was perfectly balanced. As a forensic accountant, I appreciate balance. I spend my life looking at ledgers, tracking millions of dollars through shell companies and hidden accounts, making sure that every single penny is exactly where it is supposed to be. Balance is my entire world. But when the spoon tapped the glass, the balance of the room instantly shifted. It wasn't my best man tapping the glass. It was my stepfather, Robert. Robert stood at the head table holding the microphone. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. He had that smooth, practiced smile that he always wore when he was about to control a room. He cleared his throat, and the chatter in the ballroom died down to a respectful hush. Zoe squeezed my hand under the table. She is a contract lawyer, and her instincts for impending disaster are just as sharp as mine. We both knew Robert wasn't supposed to speak yet. Family and friends. Robert's voice boomed through the speakers, deep and resonant. Today is a day of celebration, a day of love. We are here for David and Zoe. He paused, letting a warm, completely fabricated smile wash over the crowd. But as the head of this family, I also know that life is about stepping up when things are hard. It is about taking care of our own. I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. I watched his eyes shift from me to the far end of the table. He was looking at my younger brother, Caleb. Caleb looked like a wounded puppy in a rented tuxedo. His shoulders were slumped. He had a glass of whiskey clutched in his hands, staring down at the tablecloth. Just 3 weeks ago, Caleb's fiancée had called off their engagement. She had finally realized what I had known for years. Caleb was a professional parasite. He had no job, no ambition, and survived entirely on the endless financial foredrip that Robert provided. But in this family, Caleb was the golden boy. Caleb was the victim, always. As many of you know, Robert continued, his voice dipping into a tone of manufactured sorrow. My youngest son, Caleb, has recently gone through a devastating heartbreak. He lost the woman he thought he would marry. He lost the home they were supposed to share. He is hurting, deeply. A low murmur of sympathy rippled through the guests. A few ants clucked their tongues. I just sat there, my face completely blank. David is a strong man, Robert said, finally looking back at me. He is independent. He has his career. He has a brilliant new wife. He has everything a man could need. But Caleb needs a fresh start. He needs to know that this family has his back. Robert reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. My heart didn't race. It just stopped. I knew exactly what that envelope was. For the last 6 months, Robert had been bragging to everyone that his wedding gift to me was going to be the deed to a starter house in the suburbs, purchased through a family trust fund that he managed. So, Robert said, his voice rising in dramatic triumph, I have made a decision. The house I purchased for David and Zoe as a wedding gift, I am transferring the deed to Caleb. Today. Right now. Robert walked over to Caleb and placed the envelope in front of him. Caleb looked up, tears brimming in his eyes, acting perfectly stunned. He threw his arms around Robert's waist, burying his face in Robert's expensive suit, sobbing quietly. The ballroom erupted into applause. People were actually clapping. They thought they were witnessing a beautiful moment of family sacrifice. They thought I was in on it. They thought I had agreed to give up my wedding gift to save my poor, broken brother. The applause washed over me like static. I didn't yell. I didn't jump out of my chair. I didn't flip the table. In my line of work, the moment you let emotion hijack your brain, you lose the trail. When you are tracking a corporate embezzler who is shifting money through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, anger does not help you. Anger makes you blind. Cold, calculating logic is the only thing that gets the job done. So I went cold. I sat perfectly still, processing the variables of the situation. To my left, Zoe shifted in her chair. I could feel the heat radiating off her. She was a contract lawyer, a woman who read the fine print for a living and destroyed people in mediation. She opened her mouth to speak, her eyes flashing with a terrifying kind of legal fury. But before she could say a word, a hand clamped down hard on my right wrist. It was my mother, Olivia. She had leaned over from her seat, her fingers digging into my arm with surprising strength. She was wearing a pale blue dress, her hair perfectly styled, the picture of the elegant, supportive mother. But her eyes were wide, pleading, and desperate. "David," she whispered, her voice tight and low so no one else could hear. "He is hurting. Don't make a scene." That was the phrase. That was the eternal, suffocating mantra of my entire childhood. Don't make a scene. Whenever Robert was unreasonable, whenever Caleb broke my things, whenever I was pushed aside or forgotten or robbed of my own achievements, my mother was always there, gripping my arm, begging me to swallow it. Don't make a scene. Keep the peace. Just let them have this one. I looked at my mother's hand on my wrist. I looked at the diamond tennis bracelet Robert had bought her to keep her quiet. Then I looked at the head table. Caleb was still doing his routine. He wiped a tear from his cheek, looking out at the crowd with the perfect expression of a humbled, grateful victim. It was a textbook display of playing the victim. He had caused his own engagement to fail because he refused to get a job and expected his fiancée to act as his second mother. But here, in this room, he was the tragic hero, and Robert was the benevolent savior. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, flat and completely devoid of emotion. "Take your hand off me." She flinched. She had expected me to sigh, to nod, to accept the role of the good, manageable son. That was what I had always done. But not today. "David, please," she begged, her voice cracking slightly. "It is just a house. You and Zoe make good money. Caleb has nothing right now. If you say something, you will embarrass Robert in front of all his business partners. You will ruin the wedding." "He already ruined the wedding," Zoe said quietly from my other side, her tone freezing the air between us. "And it is not his house to give." I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain to my mother why this was wrong. I just stared at Caleb. He finally looked up and met my eyes. For a fraction of a second, the sad, broken puppy dog mask slipped. Underneath the fake tears, I saw it. Tiny, smug little smirk. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was reveling in it. He loved that he could take the biggest day of my life and make it all about him. He loved that Robert was publicly declaring, in front of 200 people, that Caleb's minor discomfort was more important than my entire future. I didn't react to the smirk. I just filed it away. In an audit, every little discrepancy is a clue. Caleb's smirk was a massive red flag on a balance sheet. It told me everything I needed to know about the transaction that was happening right in front of me. Robert took the microphone again, patting Caleb on the shoulder. "Family," Robert said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "That is what it is all about." He was expecting me to raise my glass to them. He was waiting for my silent submission. The entire room was waiting. But I didn't move. I just waited. Because I knew something that Robert didn't. I knew that the numbers were about to catch up with him. The silence in the ballroom began to stretch. The polite applause had died down, and the guests were starting to notice that the groom was not joining in the celebration. 200 pairs of eyes shifted from the touching scene of father and son at the microphone, back to me, sitting completely motionless at the head table. The air in the room grew heavy. It was the kind of uncomfortable quiet that happens when a script is suddenly thrown out the window. Robert's fake smile began to strain at the edges. He gave me a hard, demanding look. It was the look he used when he wanted obedience right now. Then, The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom opened. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. There was no loud bang, no shout. It was just the quiet, heavy creak of well-oiled hinges. But in that tense silence, it sounded like a gunshot. A man stepped into the room. He was in his early 60s. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a simple, well-pressed navy blue suit that looked like it had been bought off the rack at a department store. He had broad shoulders, rough, calloused hands that hung loosely at his sides, and graying hair neatly combed back. He didn't look like he belonged in a room full of Columbus, Ohio's corporate elite. He looked like a man who worked with his hands for a living. Because he did. He was a carpenter. He walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. His pace was steady, unhurried, and completely deliberate. He didn't look to the left or the right. He didn't acknowledge the whispers that were starting to ripple through the tables. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead. I felt Zoe's hand tighten around mine. She knew who he was. We had planned this together. But seeing him actually walking down that aisle, the reality of it hit me like a physical weight in my chest. My mother, who was still hovering near my chair, turned to look at the newcomer. She let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she stumbled backward, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. Robert was still standing at the microphone, his arm draped around Caleb's shoulders. He looked up, annoyed by the interruption. He squinted at the man walking toward the front of the room. I watched Robert's face carefully. As an auditor, I observe physical reactions. When you slide a piece of paper across a desk that proves a CEO is stealing, you watch their eyes. You watch their breathing. I watched Robert's brain process the information. It took about 3 seconds. First, confusion. Then, recognition. And then absolute devastating shock. The color drained from Robert's face so fast it was like someone had pulled a plug in his neck. The confident, booming patriarch vanished, replaced by a man who looked like he was about to have a heart attack. His jaw went slack. The microphone slipped an inch in his grip, producing a harsh squeal of feedback that made several guests wince. Caleb, sensing the sudden rigidity in Robert's body, pulled away and looked at the stranger, completely bewildered. The man in the navy suit reached the front of the room. He didn't go to the microphone. He didn't look at Caleb. He didn't even look at my mother, who was now gripping the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. He stopped directly in front of the head table, right across from where Robert was standing. The ballroom was dead silent now. You could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. Robert opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard. His eyes were wide, darting from the man to my mother and finally to me. For 24 years, Robert had controlled the narrative of this family. He had built a fortress of lies, and he believed he was the absolute king of it. But kings only rule as long as everyone agrees to believe in the illusion. The stranger stood there, solid as an oak tree, radiating a quiet, dangerous kind of calm. He didn't look angry. He just looked ready. He turned his head slowly, taking his eyes off Robert, and looked at me. The man in the navy suit looked at me, and for the first time in 24 years, I looked into the eyes of my biological father. His name was Arthur. I didn't stand up. I didn't break down crying. We had agreed on how this was going to play out, and I was going to execute the plan with the precision of a tax audit. I held his gaze, giving him a barely perceptible nod. Arthur reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate, making sure everyone in the room, especially Robert, could see exactly what he was doing. Robert took a half step back, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked terrified. He didn't know what Arthur was pulling out of that pocket. For all Robert knew, it was a weapon. But it wasn't a weapon. Not in the traditional sense. Arthur pulled out a small, black plastic flash drive. Beneath it, held in the same hand, was a thick, yellowed manila folder tied with a faded string. The edges of the folder were curled and stained with age. Arthur took 3 steps forward, walking around the head table, completely ignoring the security guards at the back of the room who were nervously shifting their weight, unsure if they should intervene. He stopped right beside my chair. "David," Arthur said. His voice was low, gravelly, but it carried perfectly in the dead silence of the ballroom. It was a voice I hadn't heard since I was a toddler, but somehow my bones recognized it. He held out his hand. I reached out and took the flash drive and the folder. The paper felt dry and brittle under my fingertips. The plastic of the flash drive was cool. This was it. This was the culmination of thousands of hours of work. This was the weapon I was going to use to dismantle the empire of lies Robert had built. "I kept my promise," Arthur said quietly. "Everything you asked for is in there. 24 years of it." "Thank you," I said. My voice was steady. I placed the folder on the table next to my pristine white dinner napkin. I placed the flash drive on top of it. Robert finally found his voice. It cracked, sounding thin and reedy, completely lacking its usual booming authority. What is this?" he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur. "You have no right to be here. You are not part of this family. Get out." Arthur slowly turned his head to look at Robert. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look intimidated. He looked at Robert the way you look at a termite infestation in a rotting floorboard. "I have every right to be here, Robert," Arthur said. "I am attending my son's wedding." A collective gasp went up from the tables closest to us. Whispers exploded across the room like a brush fire. People were leaning in, trying to piece together the drama playing out in front of them. Caleb was staring at me, his fake tears completely gone, replaced by profound confusion. My mother was weeping silently, her face buried in her hands. "He is not your son," Robert yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. His face was turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. "I am his father. I raised him. I paid for everything he has. You signed your rights away. You are nothing." I picked up the flash drive from the table. I held it up, just slightly, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. "He didn't sign anything away, Robert," I said. My voice cut through the room, cold and sharp as a scalpel. I didn't look at the crowd. I kept my eyes locked on the man who had tormented me for 2 decades. He was forced out. By you. Using fabricated evidence and paid witnesses. I stood up from my chair. Zoe stood up next to me, adjusting her posture into a stance of absolute legal authority. "You just told everyone you were giving my trust fund to Caleb," I continued, my voice echoing in the massive room. "But we both know that's not true, don't we? Because it was never your money to give." I looked down at the small black drive in my hand. To understand how we got to this moment, how a forensic accountant ends up holding a thumb drive that can destroy his own stepfather at his wedding reception, you have to go back. You have to understand how the ledger was falsified in the first place. To understand the sheer scale of Robert's fraud, you have to understand the environment he built. I grew up in a massive 4-bedroom house in an affluent suburb. From the outside, we were the perfect American family. The lawn was manicured by professionals every Tuesday. We took vacations to expensive resorts where the staff knew Robert by name. We had new cars, private schools, and country club memberships. But as any good accountant will tell you, a shiny exterior often hides a rotten foundation. I was adopted by Robert when I was 7 years old. My mother, Olivia, had married him when I was 5. I remember the adoption ceremony vaguely. I remember being dressed in a stiff suit, standing in front of a judge, and being told to smile. I remember Robert taking me out for ice cream afterward, leaning across the sticky table, and saying, "You are my son now. I expect you to act like it." It sounded like love to a 7-year-old. It took me years to realize it was actually a terms of service agreement. Then Caleb was born. Caleb was Robert's biological son. And from the moment Caleb arrived, the accounting methods of our family changed fundamentally. Caleb was loved. I was managed. It wasn't always obvious. Robert was too smart to be cartoonishly evil. It was in the margins. It was the allocation of resources. If Caleb wanted a new guitar, he got a custom-made electric Fender the next day, which he would play for a week and then abandon in a closet. If I wanted a laptop for high school, I was given a lecture on the value of hard work, a chore chart, and a refurbished brick that crashed whenever I opened too many tabs. When Caleb crashed his first car drunk, though Robert paid a lot of money to make sure that details stayed off the police report, he was bought a safer, newer model the following week. When I got accepted into a prestigious accounting program, Robert told me he would only contribute to my tuition if I studied business management and came to work for his logistics firm. I refused. I took out student loans. I worked night shifts as a data entry clerk to pay my rent. And every time I came home for a holiday, the dynamic was painfully clear. Caleb would be sleeping until noon, nursing a hangover, while Robert cheerfully cooked him bacon. I would be sitting at the kitchen island, quietly running statistical models for my finals, while my mother hovered around, making sure I didn't leave any papers out to clutter Robert's counter. Robert used money the way a dog trainer uses treats and a choke collar. He created an environment where everyone was entirely dependent on his financial approval. My mother had not worked a day since she married him. She was entirely reliant on the credit cards he paid off every month. Caleb was a financial black hole, incapable of generating a single dollar of his own income. I was the outlier. I was the one variable in Robert's equation that refused to balance out the way he wanted. Because I didn't want his money, his power over me was limited. But he still demanded obedience. He demanded that I play the role of the grateful adopted son, the background character in the grand narrative of his generosity. I played along. I learned to keep my mouth shut. I learned to observe. I sat at dinner tables listening to him brag about his brilliant business deals, noting the discrepancies in his stories. I watched how he manipulated my mother with guilt. I watched how he kept Caleb weak so Caleb would never leave. I didn't realize it at the time, but growing up in that house was the best training I could have ever received for my career. Forensic accounting is not just about math. It is about understanding human psychology. It is about recognizing the patterns of deception. When someone is lying about their money, they leave a trail. They create a false reality to hide the truth. Robert had created a false reality for our entire family. And the biggest lie of all was the one he told me about the man who was standing at my wedding. The story of my biological father was delivered to me in small, carefully managed doses, always curated by Robert, and always supported by my mother's terrified silence. Growing up, the narrative was airtight. His name was Thomas Hale, though the man who walked into my wedding asked me to call him Arthur, his middle name the name he preferred. The official family record stated that Arthur was a disaster. According to Robert, my mother had made a terrible mistake in her 20s. Arthur was a deadbeat, a drunk, a man who couldn't hold down a job as a carpenter, who was violent, unpredictable, and completely unfit to be a parent. The story went that when I was 2 years old, Arthur had abandoned us. He had signed away his parental rights in a courthouse, glad to be rid of the responsibility, and had disappeared into a bottle somewhere in the Rust Belt. Robert was the white knight. Robert had swooped in, married my broken mother, adopted the abandoned child, and provided a life of luxury and stability. That was the ledger I was handed. For a long time I believed it, because why wouldn't I? I was a kid. You trust the balance sheet your parents give you until you learn how to run and audit yourself. But because I was told I carried the genetics of a failure, I became obsessed with control. I became hypervigilant. If Arthur was chaos, I would be order. I structured my life with ruthless efficiency. I didn't drink. I didn't take risks. I gravitated toward numbers because numbers do not lie. A column of figures either adds up or it doesn't. There is no gray area in a spreadsheet. I became a forensic accountant because I found deep, profound comfort in hunting down discrepancies. My job is to walk into a corporation that looks perfectly healthy on paper, tear apart their financial statements, and find the rot hidden in the subaccounts. I am the guy who finds the phantom employees, the inflated expenses, the money being siphoned off to offshore accounts. I rip away the illusion to expose the reality. And as I got older and my skills sharpened, I started looking at the illusion of my own family. I started noticing the gaps in Robert's story. If Arthur was a violent drunk who didn't care about me, why did my mother always look so profoundly sad, rather than relieved, when his name accidentally came up? Why did Robert completely shut down any questions about the adoption proceedings? If the case was cut and dry, why was it a forbidden topic? I learned to read the silence in my house the way I read missing sequential invoice numbers in an audit. The absence of data is often more telling than the data itself. But I never pushed it. I was busy building my career. I was busy making sure I would never need a dime of Robert's money. I maintained a polite, emotionally sterile relationship with my family. I showed up for Thanksgiving. I bought Caleb's standard, thoughtless Christmas presents. I played the role. I kept the peace. Until the day Robert finally crossed the line from emotional manipulation to actual literal theft. In my profession, we call it a catalyst event. It is the moment when a minor irregularity suddenly reveals a massive, systemic fraud. You find one forged receipt, and suddenly you realize the entire company is a Ponzi scheme. For me, that catalyst event happened exactly 1 year before my wedding. It was the moment the good son officially died, and the forensic accountant took over. It was the day I realized that Robert wasn't just a narcissist. He was a thief, and he had stolen something much more valuable than my childhood. He had stolen my savings, and he used it to cover the tracks of his golden boy. The catalyst event wasn't loud. Most financial crimes aren't. They happen in the quiet hum of a computer server. A year ago, I was preparing to put a down payment on a modest townhouse. I had been saving aggressively for 5 years, living in a cheap apartment, eating takeout, dumping every spare dollar into a high-yield savings account that I had opened when I was 18. The account was at the same bank Robert used for his business. It was a remnant of my teenage years, tied to a joint profile he had set up when I first got a part-time job. I had meant to sever the link for years, but it was one of those administrative tasks I kept putting off. It was a mistake, a massive rookie mistake. On a Tuesday morning, I logged into my banking portal to wire the earnest money to the escrow company. The balance on the screen loaded. It was zero, $85,000. Gone. I didn't panic. I am an accountant. I assume banking errors before I assume malice. I pulled up the transaction history. There was a single, outgoing wire transfer initiated at 2 in the morning on a Sunday, clearing on Monday. The money had been routed into a Shell LLC holding account. It took me exactly 14 minutes of digging through public corporate registry databases to find the beneficial owner of that LLC. It was Robert. I left my office, drove across town to Robert's logistics company, and walked past his receptionist straight into his glass-walled office. He was on a phone call laughing about a golf handicap. He saw my face, told the person he had to call them back, and hung up. "David," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, looking mildly annoyed. "You didn't make an appointment. Where is my $85,000, Robert?" I asked. I didn't yell. My voice was dead flat. He didn't even have the decency to look surprised. He sighed, adjusting his expensive tie. "Sit down, David. Don't be dramatic." I remained standing. Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his mahogany desk. "Caleb got himself into a situation," Robert said smoothly. The cognitive dissonance in his voice was staggering. He was talking about stealing my life savings like he was explaining a change in the weather. He got involved with some crypto traders. Margin calls. It got ugly. The people he owed money to were not the kind of people you can negotiate a payment plan with. He needed cash immediately to clear the debt before they took legal action or worse. "So you stole my down payment," I said. "I did not steal it," Robert said, his tone turning sharp, offended. "I reallocated family resources. I didn't have the liquid cash on hand without pulling from the business accounts, which would have triggered a tax event. Your money was sitting right there doing nothing. Family helps family, David. You are the older brother. You have a great job. You can make it back. I stared at him. I looked at the utter lack of remorse in his eyes. He truly believed he had the right to take my money because he viewed me and everything I produced as his property. Caleb had gambled away 85 grand on internet coins, and I was the one paying the penalty. I want it back. By the end of the day, I said. Robert stood up. The mask of the reasonable father vanished. You will get it back when I decide to put it back, he snarled. I put a roof over your head for 15 years. I fed you. I clothed you. You owe this family everything you are. You will not make a scene about this. You will go back to work and you will keep your mouth shut because if you try to make trouble, I will tie you up in civil litigation for the next 10 years. Do you understand me? I looked at him for a long, silent moment. I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't a loud break. It was the quiet, precise severing of a wire. The good son who wanted approval died in that office. In his place, the auditor woke up. I understand, I said quietly. I turned and walked out. I didn't go to the police. Going to the police would tip him off. It would give him time to hide his assets. You don't warn a target that they are under investigation. You smile, you nod, and you quietly begin to pull their entire life apart. I needed a partner. You can't take down a man like Robert alone. He had high-priced lawyers, deep pockets, and a lifetime of experience manipulating the system. I had the financial tracking skills, but I needed someone who knew how to turn those numbers into a legal guillotine. Enter Zoe. I had been dating Zoe for a year. She was a corporate contract lawyer, a woman who spent her days dismantling multi-million-dollar mergers and looking for loopholes that could destroy entire companies. She was brilliant, ruthless in a courtroom, and possessed a moral compass that pointed violently toward justice. That night, I went to her apartment. I didn't buy flowers. I didn't try to soften the blow. I sat down at her kitchen table, opened my laptop, and showed her the wire transfer. Then, I told her everything. I told her about Caleb's endless parasitic existence. I told her about Robert's absolute control. I told her about the $85,000 stolen to cover a crypto debt. Zoe listened in complete silence. She didn't offer empty sympathy. She didn't cry. She poured us both a glass of bourbon, sat down across from me, and looked at the screen. He thinks he's immune because it's a family account, Zoe said, her eyes narrowing as she read the transaction data. He thinks the implied consent of a joint account protects him from wire fraud charges. Does it? I asked. Zoe took a sip of her bourbon. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. Not if we can prove a pattern of systemic financial abuse and commingling of funds to defraud a beneficiary. But 85 grand isn't enough to put him away, David. It's enough to get your money back in civil court, but he'll just pay the fine and keep doing it. If you want to stop him, we have to find the rot at the foundation. I want to audit his entire life, I said. Zoe nodded. Then we need a distraction. Something massive. Something that will take up all of his attention and make him feel so powerful, so completely in control, that he won't notice you digging through his financial trash. 6 months later, I proposed to Zoe. We didn't just plan a wedding. We planned a sting operation. We knew exactly how Robert operated. We went to him and played the roles perfectly. We told him we wanted a big wedding but couldn't quite afford the luxury venue Zoe dreamed of. Robert took the bait immediately. He offered to fund the entire wedding. He offered to buy us a house as a gift. He thought he was buying our submission. He thought he was proving, once again, that he was the financial god of the family. He spent hours dictating the guest list, choosing the caterer, lecturing me on the cost per plate. I agreed to everything. I smiled. I shook his hand. I let him play the king. And while Robert was busy arguing with florists about the exact shade of white roses for the centerpieces, I was busy running forensic sweeps on his corporate tax filings from the last 20 years. While my mother was dragging Zoe to endless dress fittings, Zoe was quietly filing subpoenas through her firm's private investigators to pull Robert's historical banking records. We let Robert build a massive, glittering stage for himself. We let him invite all his business partners, his country club friends, everyone he wanted to impress. We let him set up the exact moment where he would stand at the microphone and try to humiliate me by giving my gift to Caleb. We built the trap. Robert walked right into it, arrogant and blind. But what we didn't expect, what neither Zoe nor I could have ever predicted when we started digging into Robert's past, was the ghost we were going to find buried in the ledgers from 2002. The ghost of a carpenter named Arthur. The investigation started on a Thursday evening, 2 days after Robert told me he had stolen my house deposit to save Caleb. I didn't go to a bar. I didn't break things. I went to my home office, locked the door, and opened my laptop. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a room when a forensic accountant goes to war. It is not an angry silence. It is the silence of a surgeon laying out their scalpels. Robert thought he was untouchable because he was my stepfather, because he controlled the family narrative, and because he hid his money behind layers of corporate jargon that my mother and brother were too lazy to understand. But he forgot one crucial detail. He forgot what I do for a living. I started with the joint account he had drained. A joint account requires dual authorization for structural changes, but basic wire transfers only need one signature. That was his loophole. But every transfer leaves a digital footprint. Money does not simply vanish. It moves, changes hands, changes currencies, changes jurisdictions. I pulled the routing numbers from the wire transfer that wiped out my savings. It went to a limited liability company registered in Delaware. Delaware is a notoriously secretive state for corporate registrations, but Zoe, my brilliant fiancée, had resources. As a senior contract lawyer at a top-tier firm, she had access to private investigative databases that normal citizens do not even know exist. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, sipping black coffee, typing rapidly on her own secure terminal. Within 3 hours, she had pierced the corporate veil of the Delaware company. It was a shell corporation. The registered agent was a retired lawyer who used to play golf with Robert. But the beneficial owner, the person who actually controlled the assets, was Robert himself. He had stolen my money and moved it into his own secret piggy bank to cover Caleb's gambling debts without exposing his primary business accounts to an audit. That was the thread. And once a forensic accountant finds a loose thread, we do not stop pulling until the entire sweater unravels. For the next 4 months, my life became a dual existence. By day, I smiled at Robert. I let him buy me expensive dinners. I let him brag about how much he was spending on my wedding. I listened to him tell Caleb that he needed to get his life together, knowing full well Robert was still secretly paying off Caleb's credit cards. I played the good, manageable son perfectly. But by night, Zoe and I were running a full-scale financial autopsy on Robert's entire life. We cross-referenced his tax returns with his public spending. Narcissists like Robert always make the same mistake. Their ego is too big to hide their wealth. He claimed heavy business losses on his logistics company to avoid paying federal taxes, but he simultaneously bought a new imported sports car and a vacation home in Florida. The math did not balance. You cannot claim poverty to the Internal Revenue Service while paying cash for a boat. I built a master spreadsheet. I tracked every dollar that flowed into his business and every dollar that flowed out. I found phantom employees on his payroll, people who did not exist, whose salaries were being funneled back into Robert's private accounts. I found inflated vendor invoices. He was billing his own company for services that were never rendered, washing the money through 3 different bank accounts to make it look clean. It was a textbook embezzlement scheme, executed with the arrogant sloppiness of a man who believed no one would ever dare to check his work. But the tax fraud and the corporate theft were not the worst things I found. The worst thing, the thing that made my blood run ice cold, was buried deep in a dusty, archived ledger from 24 years ago. It was a small, seemingly insignificant series of transactions. But to a trained eye, it was a glaring red flag. It was the financial evidence of a stolen childhood. The discrepancy appeared when I was auditing a series of closed accounts from the early 2000s. Robert had a habit of opening small trust accounts, moving money through them, and then closing them to avoid long-term tax liabilities. But there was one account that didn't fit his usual pattern. It was a custodial savings account, opened in 1994, the year I was born. The primary depositor was not Robert. The name on the original deposit slip was Thomas Arthur Hale, my biological father. According to Robert's official family narrative, Arthur was a deadbeat who had never contributed a dime to my existence. But the bank records told a completely different story. The ledger showed consistent, biweekly deposits of $200. It wasn't a fortune, but for a young carpenter in the mid-90s, it was a significant chunk of change. Arthur had been putting money away for me, faithfully every single month, for 7 years. By the year 2002, the account had grown to a modest sum of just over $12,000. Then, the deposits suddenly stopped. That was the year Robert legally adopted me. That was the year Arthur supposedly abandoned me and signed away his rights. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes tracking the data. If Arthur had walked away, the money should have sat there, gathering interest until I turned 18. But it didn't. 2 months after the adoption was finalized, Robert petitioned the court to take over as the financial custodian of the account. He claimed it was for my benefit. The judge granted it. And then Robert drained it. I tracked the outgoing funds. Robert didn't put the money into a college fund for me. He didn't put it toward my living expenses. He made 3 distinct withdrawals. 2 withdrawals were for exactly $3,000 each, issued as cashier's checks. The third withdrawal was for the remaining balance, which was transferred directly into Robert's personal checking account. I stared at the 2 cashier's checks. $3,000 each. $6,000 total. Why would Robert, a man who already had a successful business, need $6,000 in untraceable cashier's checks right after winning a custody battle? I called Zoe into the room. I pointed to the screen. Zoe looked at the dates. She cross-referenced them with the legal file she had pulled regarding my adoption. Her face went pale. "David," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The family court records from 2002. Robert's lawyer submitted affidavits from 2 independent witnesses. They testified that Arthur was a violent alcoholic, that he had threatened them, and that he was entirely unfit to be a father. Their testimony is what convinced the judge to terminate Arthur's parental rights involuntarily. I felt the air get sucked out of the room. "You think he paid them? Look at the dates," Zoe said, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. The cashier's checks were issued 4 days before the final custody hearing. $3,000 to each witness. Robert didn't just steal your father from you. He used your own money, the money your father saved for you, to buy the perjury that destroyed him. It was a level of cruelty that defied logic. It was not just greedy. It was sadistic. Robert had weaponized my real father's love against him. He had taken a carpenter's hard-earned savings and used it as a bribe to erase the man from my life. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing numbers on the screen. The ledger was complete. The illusion was dead. Robert was not a savior. He was a kidnapper wearing a tailored suit. "I want to find him," I said to Zoe, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I want to find Arthur." Zoe didn't ask if I was sure. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She just sat down at her computer, opened a new encrypted search window and said, "Give me 24 hours. Finding a man who has been systematically erased from the system is difficult, but not impossible." Zoe found Arthur's current address through an old union registration for independent carpenters. He was living in a small, working-class neighborhood in Dayton, about an hour-and-a-half drive from Columbus. I didn't call him. You do not deliver 24 years of stolen history over the telephone. I took a Friday off from work, drove to Dayton, and parked my car across the street from a small, single-story house with a neat lawn and a wooden porch. I sat in the car for 20 minutes watching the front door. For the first time in my life, my heart was hammering against my ribs. I was a forensic accountant. I dealt with numbers, not ghosts. I had no idea what I was walking into. What if Robert's lies had a grain of truth? What if Arthur really was broken, unstable, or simply didn't want to see me? I forced myself out of the car. I walked up the driveway and knocked on the door. The door opened. The man standing there was in his early 60s. He was wearing faded denim jeans and a flannel shirt dusted with sawdust. He had lines around his eyes, the kind that come from a lifetime of squinting into the sun and measuring wood. He looked at me, confused for a fraction of a second. Then his eyes widened. The color drained from his face, and his breath caught in his throat. He knew exactly who I was. "David," he breathed. It wasn't a question. "Hello, Arthur," I said. My voice was tight. "Can I come in?" He stepped back immediately, opening the door wide. His hands were shaking. I walked into his living room. It was modest, clean, and smelled faintly of pine wood and old coffee. There was no expensive art on the walls. No crystal chandeliers like Robert's house. But on the small wooden coffee table in the center of the room, there was a stack of photo albums. And on the refrigerator, held up by a cheap magnet that read "Ohio is for lovers," was a faded, slightly crumpled photograph of a 2-year-old boy sitting in a high chair. Me. Arthur stood awkwardly in the center of the room. He didn't rush to hug me. He didn't cry dramatically. He just looked at me with a reverence that made my chest ache. "I didn't know if you would ever come," Arthur said quietly. "I didn't know what they told you about me. I didn't want to ruin your life by showing up uninvited." "They told me you abandoned me," I said flatly. "They told me you were a drunk." Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, a look of profound, exhausted pain washing over his face. "I never had a drop of alcohol in my life, David. My father died of liver failure. I swore I would never touch the stuff." He looked back at me, his voice trembling slightly. "I fought for you. I spent every dollar I had on public defenders. But Robert had money. He had lawyers. He had people willing to stand up in court and swear on a Bible that I was a monster. The judge looked at a poor carpenter and a rich executive, and he made his choice." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the printed spreadsheet showing the withdrawals from the trust fund. I laid it on the coffee table. "I know," I said. "I found the money. I found the bribes. He used the trust fund you set up for me to pay the witnesses." Arthur looked at the paper. He traced the numbers with a calloused finger. He didn't look angry. He just looked incredibly sad. "I built your crib," he whispered. "I put it together on the living room floor. Took me a whole weekend. I just wanted to be your father." I looked at this quiet, gentle man, and then I thought about Robert. I thought about the screaming matches, the financial manipulation, the constant, suffocating demand for gratitude. "I am getting married in 3 months," I said. I looked Arthur straight in the eye. "And I need your help to burn Robert's empire to the ground." For the next 90 days, I lived a masterclass in deception. To Robert, to Caleb, and to my mother, I was the perfect groom. I attended tuxedo fittings. I tasted wedding cakes. I sat in Robert's sprawling living room and let him lecture me about the importance of family loyalty, while Caleb complained about his expensive gym membership. I agreed with everything Robert said. I fed his narcissism daily, inflating his ego to the point where he felt completely invincible. He loved it. He believed that by buying my wedding, he was buying the final, permanent rights to my submission. He proudly announced to his friends that he was gifting me a house. He made sure everyone knew how generous he was, how he was the ultimate patriarch. Behind the scenes, the trap was being armed. Arthur and I met in secret once a week at a diner halfway between Columbus and Dayton. He gave me everything he had. He gave me the original transcripts of the custody hearing. He gave me the names of the 2 witnesses Robert had bribed. Zoe took those names and went hunting. She found one of the witnesses living in a trailer park in Arizona, drowning in medical debt. She didn't threaten him. She simply explained that the statute of limitations on perjury had passed, but the guilt he was carrying didn't have an expiration date. The man, terrified and remorseful, signed a sworn legal affidavit confessing that Robert had paid him $3,000 in 2002 to lie about Arthur on the stand. We had the smoking gun. But I didn't just want to prove the perjury. I wanted absolute, total financial destruction. I spent my nights compiling a massive index dossier for the Internal Revenue Service. I mapped out Robert's tax evasion, the shell companies, the phantom employees, and the commingled funds. I drafted a comprehensive whistleblower report that was so detailed, so mathematically undeniable, that the federal agents would not even need to investigate. They would just need to arrest him. Zoe prepared a civil lawsuit for the theft of my $85,000, complete with emergency injunctions to freeze Robert's personal and business assets the moment the lawsuit was filed. We scheduled the filing of the lawsuit and the delivery of the federal whistleblower report for the exact date of my wedding. I also prepared a special presentation. I took the bank statements showing the bribes, the wire transfers stealing my money, and the fake tax returns, and I loaded them onto a single encrypted black flash drive. I gave the flash drive to Arthur. "When do I bring this out?" Arthur asked, holding the small piece of plastic like it was a live grenade. "You wait until the reception," I told him. "You wait until he takes the microphone. Robert cannot resist a crowd. He will try to make a grand speech. He will try to humiliate someone to prove his power. When he does, you walk in." The week before the wedding, the tension in my body was so high I could barely sleep. My mother kept hovering around me, sensing that something was slightly off, but too afraid to ask. She kept adjusting my collar, telling me how proud Robert was of me. Every time she said his name, I had to force my jaw to unclench. The night of the rehearsal dinner, Robert raised a glass of expensive champagne. He looked at me, then at Caleb, who was sulking in the corner. "To David," Robert toasted, his voice echoing in the private dining room. "A man who knows the value of the family that built him." I raised my water glass. I looked right through him. "To family," I said smoothly. I went back to my hotel room that night, opened my laptop one last time, and sent the final email to Zoe's legal team, authorizing the release of the documents to the authorities the following afternoon. The audit was complete. It was time to deliver the findings. The ballroom was completely silent as I stood up from the head table. The flash drive Arthur had just handed me felt heavy in my palm. The 200 guests, the string quartet, the catering staff. Everyone was frozen, watching the confrontation unfold. Robert was turning a dangerous shade of red, his chest heaving as he stared at Arthur, the man he had erased 24 years ago, who was now standing firmly in the center of the room. "You have no right to be here," Robert hissed again, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. It sounded thin, desperate. He looked around the room, trying to rally the crowd to his side. "Security! Remove this man!" The two security guards at the back of the room shifted uncomfortably, but before they could take a step forward, Zoe stood up. She did not look like a blushing bride. She looked like a senior partner in a law firm about to destroy a hostile witness. "If anyone lays a hand on Arthur Hale," Zoe said, her voice carrying a terrifying legal clarity, "I will personally name you as a co-defendant in a federal civil rights lawsuit before the sun sets. Stand down." The guards immediately stepped back and crossed their arms. No one messes with a lawyer in a wedding dress. I turned my attention away from the guards and looked at the large projection screen behind the head table. It had been set up to play a slideshow of Zoe and me during dinner. I walked over to the media cart, pulled the cable from the presentation laptop, and plugged the black flash drive directly into the port. "What are you doing, David?" Robert demanded, his voice cracking. "Stop this nonsense right now. You are ruining your own wedding. Caleb is in pain, and you are throwing a tantrum." "I am not throwing a tantrum, Robert," I said. My voice was entirely flat. I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. "I am presenting a balance sheet." I hit the spacebar. The massive screen behind me flickered, and the romantic photos of Zoe and me vanished. In their place, a high-resolution image of a bank statement appeared. It was 50 feet wide, glowing brightly in the dim ballroom. A collective murmur rolled through the crowd. People were squinting, trying to read the text. "This," I said, pointing a laser pointer at the screen, "is the custodial trust account set up for me in 1994 by my biological father, Arthur Hale. The man you just tried to have thrown out. As you can see, he deposited $200 every 2 weeks until 2002. The year you adopted me. I clicked the remote. The next slide appeared. It was the withdrawal record. And this, I continued, tracing the red circle on the screen, is you, Robert, draining that exact account. 2 cashier's checks. $3,000 each. Robert's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The color completely drained from his face. "This is a private family matter," he shouted, stepping toward me. "Turn that screen off." I ignored him and clicked the remote again. 2 legal affidavits appeared side by side. They were sworn statements from the witnesses from the custody trial. "These are sworn confessions," I said, my voice cutting through the rising whispers in the room. "The men you paid $3,000 each to lie on the stand. You used the money my father saved for me to buy the perjury that allowed you to steal me. You didn't save me, Robert. You bought me." The room erupted. Gasps, low curses, and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the air. My aunts and uncles, the people who had praised Robert for 2 decades, were staring at the screen in absolute horror. "Lies!" Robert screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "It's a forgery. He made this up. He's ungrateful." I didn't argue. I just clicked the remote again. The screen shifted from the 2002 records to a modern wire transfer. It was the transfer showing the theft of my $85,000 house deposit. "Let's talk about gratitude," I said smoothly. "Let's talk about the house you just promised to give to Caleb." The image on the massive screen was undeniable. It showed a direct wire transfer of $85,000 from my savings account into Robert's Hidden Delaware LLC, and then a subsequent transfer of that exact amount to a cryptocurrency exchange registered under Caleb's name. "You didn't buy a house for me, Robert," I said, looking out at the stunned faces of his business partners. "You stole my life savings to cover Caleb's gambling debts. And then you stood up here today, playing the generous patriarch, giving away a house that doesn't exist, to distract everyone from the fact that you are a thief." I looked at Caleb. This was the moment of truth. In psychology, there is a term for what abusers do when they are cornered. It is called DARVO. Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. I knew Robert would try it, but I was curious to see how the golden boy would react when the spotlight of reality finally hit him. Caleb panicked. The fake tears of heartbreak vanished, replaced by sheer, terrified self-preservation. He looked at the screen, then looked at the enraged faces of our extended family, and finally he looked at Robert. He realized the sinking ship was going down, and he had no intention of drowning with the captain. "I didn't know," Caleb shouted, his voice shrill and panicked. He pointed a trembling finger at Robert. "He told me the money was from his business. He told me it was clean. I didn't know he stole it from David." Robert whipped his head around, staring at his biological son in absolute betrayal. "Caleb, shut your mouth." "No!" Caleb yelled, stepping away from Robert as if the man were radioactive. He turned to the crowd, clasping his hands together, instantly falling into his favorite role, the victim. "I am a victim here too. I trusted him. He lied to me. My fiancée left me. My life is falling apart. And now my own father is dragging me into federal wire fraud? How could you do this to me, Dad?" It was the most pathetic display of cowardice I had ever witnessed. Caleb was willing to sell out the man who had funded his entire useless existence just to save his own skin. I leaned into the microphone. "You knew exactly where the money came from, Caleb," I said coldly. "Because you forged my signature on the secondary authorization form to release the hold on the account. We have the digital signature logs." Caleb froze. His mouth hung open. He looked from me to Zoe and realized he was completely trapped. Robert, abandoned by his golden boy and exposed in front of his peers, lost whatever remaining shred of sanity he possessed. He lunged toward me, his fists clenched, his face a mask of pure, narcissistic rage. "I made you," Robert roared, charging the head table. You were nothing. You are a spreadsheet pushing nobody. I own you. He didn't make it within 5 feet of me. Arthur, who had been standing quietly off to the side, stepped smoothly into Robert's path. Arthur didn't throw a punch. He didn't yell. He simply planted his feet, grabbed Robert by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo, and used his carpenter's grip to lift Robert slightly off his feet, shoving him backward. Robert stumbled, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the polished hardwood floor, and crashed hard into an empty chair, tumbling to the ground in a humiliating heap. "Don't you ever raise your voice at my son again," Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a deadly, absolute authority. The ballroom was in total chaos. People were standing up, shouting. Robert's business partners were whispering frantically to their wives, already calculating how quickly they needed to distance their companies from Robert's logistics firm. From the floor, Robert looked up. He was panting, humiliated, his custom suit wrinkled and covered in dust. He looked toward the third row of tables, searching for the one person who had always validated his reality. He looked for his wife. "Olivia," Robert barked, pointing at her. Tell them he's lying. Defend your husband." The room grew quiet again, turning their attention to my mother. My mother, Olivia, was still standing by the table. She looked incredibly small in her pale blue dress. For 24 years, she had been the enforcer of Robert's reality. She was the one who grabbed my arm, the one who told me to keep the peace, the one who demanded I smile and pretend everything was fine. Robert stared at her, expecting the usual obedience. "Tell them he's crazy, Olivia. Tell them Arthur abandoned you." Olivia looked at Robert on the floor. Then she looked at the massive screen projecting the evidence of his crimes. Then, slowly, she turned her head and looked at Arthur, the man she had loved when she was young, the man she had allowed to be destroyed. Finally, she looked at me. I didn't give her an easy out. I just stared back, waiting. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Her hands were shaking violently, but she clasped them together in front of her waist to steady them. "He isn't lying," she said. Her voice was soft, but the acoustics of the silent ballroom carried it to every corner. Robert's eyes widened in horror. "Olivia, shut up." "No," she said, her voice growing slightly stronger. She stepped out from behind the table, standing fully in the open. "I won't shut up. Not anymore. David is telling the truth." She turned to face the crowd of guests. "Arthur did not abandon us. Robert pushed him out, and I let him do it." Tears began to stream down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "I found out about the bribes in 2006. Robert told me himself after he had a few too many drinks. He bragged about it. He told me he did it because he wanted total control of the family, and Arthur was an inconvenience." A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. This wasn't an angry stepson making accusations. This was the wife, the perfect, loyal wife, confirming the monster hiding behind the tailored suit. "Why didn't you say anything?" One of my aunts called out from the back, her voice laced with disgust. My mother flinched as if she had been struck. She looked down at the floor. "Because I was a coward," she sobbed. "I was terrified of him. I had no money of my own. I had no career. He told me that if I ever tried to leave, or if I ever told the truth, he would do to me exactly what he did to Arthur. He would take Caleb, he would take David, and he would leave me with nothing. So I stayed. I kept the peace. I told myself I was protecting the boys." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, agonizing guilt. "I am so sorry, David. I traded your real father for a comfortable house. I knew he was stealing your money last year, and I didn't warn you. I let him manage you. I am so sorry." I looked at my mother. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel forgiveness either. I just felt a profound sense of pity. She had spent her entire life living in a gilded cage, defending the warden who kept her locked inside. "Your apologies don't balance the ledger, Mom," I said quietly. Robert scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in absolute fury. The illusion was entirely shattered. His son was a traitor, his wife had confessed, and his crimes were broadcast on a 50-foot screen. "You are all dead to me," Robert screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "I am cutting you all off. You get nothing. I will bury you in court. David, I will sue you for defamation. I will bankrupt you. I will make sure you never work as an accountant in this state again." Zoe stepped forward, standing right beside me. She looked at her watch, a calm, predatory smile on her lips. "You aren't going to sue anyone, Robert," Zoe said smoothly, "because you are not going to have any lawyers, or any money, or any freedom." Right on cue, the heavy doors at the back of the ballroom swung open for the second time that afternoon. 4 men and 2 women walked into the ballroom. They were not wearing suits or tuxedos. They were wearing dark windbreakers with yellow block letters printed on the back. FBI, Economic Crimes Division. Following closely behind them were 2 uniformed officers from the Columbus Police Department. The entire ballroom collectively stopped breathing. It is one thing to witness a dramatic family argument at a wedding. It is another thing entirely to watch a federal raid unfold during the cake cutting. The lead agent, a tall, serious-looking woman with a badge clipped to her belt, walked straight down the center aisle. She didn't look at the flowers. She didn't look at the shocked guests. She walked directly toward the head table, her eyes locked on Robert. Robert froze. The screaming died in his throat. He looked at the federal agents, and for the first time in his life, the reality of his actions hit him. He wasn't dealing with a wife he could intimidate or a son he could control. He was dealing with the federal government. "Robert Kwan?" the lead agent asked, stopping a few feet away from him. Robert swallowed hard. He tried to muster up his CEO persona, puffing out his chest. "Yes, I am Robert Kwan. What is the meaning of this? This is a private event. I demand you leave." "Mr. Kwan, you are under arrest," the agent said, her voice a flat, bureaucratic monotone that cut through his bluster like a knife. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. We also have injunctions to freeze all personal and corporate assets associated with your name and your logistics firm." "This is absurd," Robert sputtered, taking a step back as the 2 uniformed officers moved in behind him. "I want to call my lawyer. This is a misunderstanding. This little ungrateful bastard rigged those documents on the screen." "Your attorney has already been notified, Mr. Kwan," the agent replied smoothly. "And the documents on the screen match the bank records we subpoenaed 48 hours ago, thanks to a very thorough whistleblower report." She glanced at me. I gave her a small, polite nod. The officers grabbed Robert's arms. He tried to pull away, his panic finally breaking through his arrogance. "You can't do this. I am a respected businessman. Caleb, tell them it was your crypto debt." Caleb, who had backed himself into a corner near the catering tables, actively tried to blend into the drapes. He didn't say a word. He just watched his golden ticket get handcuffed. They clicked the metal cuffs around Robert's wrists. The sound was sharp and final. They turned him around and began to march him down the aisle, right past the tables of his country club friends, right past his business partners who were already pulling out their phones to call their own attorneys. Robert looked completely broken. His shoulders were slumped. His expensive suit was ruined. He looked exactly like what he was. A pathetic, greedy old man who had finally run out of lies. As he passed my table, he looked at me. His eyes were full of venom. "You ruined the family," he hissed. "No, Robert," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I just finalized the audit." They marched him out the doors. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, sealing his fate. The ballroom was left in a state of absolute, stunned silence. 200 people sat frozen in their chairs. I looked over at Zoe. She smiled at me, a genuine, beautiful smile. I looked at Arthur, who was standing quietly, his hands in his pockets, watching the doors where Robert had just disappeared. Then, I turned to the officiant, an older gentleman who had been standing frozen in the corner the entire time, clutching his binder to his chest like a shield. "Well," I said, breaking the silence, "we paid for the venue until midnight. Should we finish getting married?" The officiant blinked, looked at the crowd, looked at me, and let out a shaky breath. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I think we should. Getting married 15 minutes after having your stepfather arrested by the FBI is an unconventional way to start a life together. But for Zoe and me, it felt absolutely perfect. The toxic energy that had suffocated my entire life was gone, marched out the doors in handcuffs. The air in the ballroom felt lighter, cleaner. About 30 people left immediately. They were Robert's business cronies and a few overly sensitive relatives who couldn't handle the scandal. We didn't stop them. We didn't care. The people who stayed, Zoe's family, my college friends, and a few aunts who had always secretly hated Robert, gathered closer to the front. Zoe and I stood at the altar. We didn't use the traditional vows we had originally written. We didn't need to. We looked at each other, standing in the wreckage of a narcissist's empire, and we spoke the truth. "I promise to never manage you," I told her, holding both of her hands. "I promise to never lie to you, to never use money to control you, and to never ask you to keep the peace at the expense of your own truth. You are my partner. You are my equal. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure our ledger is always balanced." Zoe wiped a tear from her eye, laughing softly. "I promise to always read the fine print with you," she said. "I promise to stand by you when the audits are hard, and to never let anyone make you feel like you owe them your soul. I love you, David, exactly as you are. Not as a project, not as an asset, just you." When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause that erupted from the remaining guests wasn't polite or formal. It was loud, chaotic, and completely genuine. People were cheering. During the reception, the atmosphere completely changed. It wasn't a stuffy, corporate networking event anymore. It felt like a real party. The string quartet packed up, and the DJ started playing actual music. I walked over to where Arthur was sitting at a quiet table near the back. He had a glass of water in his hand, watching the dance floor. He looked entirely out of place in his department store suit among the crystal centerpieces, but he also looked completely at peace. I sat down next to him. "You doing okay?" I asked. He smiled, a slow, gentle curve of his lips. "It's a lot," he admitted, "but watching you stand up there, watching the man you became, it was the best day of my life, David." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, worn envelope bound with a rubber band. He slid it across the table toward me. "These are the letters," Arthur said softly. "I wrote one every month for 24 years. I never sent them because I knew Robert would just intercept them and use them to hurt you. But I kept them. I wanted you to know that there was never a day, not a single day, where I didn't think about you." I looked at the thick stack of paper. It felt heavier than any financial document I had ever held. "Thank you," I said. I picked up the envelope and put it safely in the inside pocket of my tuxedo jacket, right next to my heart. "So," Arthur said, leaning back in his chair, "what happens now?" "Now?" I looked over at Caleb, who was sitting alone at an empty table, staring blankly at his phone, realizing his free ride was permanently over. Then I looked at the door where my mother had quietly slipped out an hour earlier, unable to face the consequences of her complicity. "Now," I said, "we let the numbers sort themselves out, and we go on living." Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own sanity? How long did it take you to realize they were managing you instead of loving you? Let me know in the comments. Zoe and I didn't go to a tropical island for our honeymoon. We couldn't. The fallout from Robert's arrest required my presence as the primary witness for the federal investigation. Instead, we booked a quiet cabin in the Hocking Hills, completely isolated from the chaos of the city. On our first night there, after Zoe had fallen asleep, I sat by the stone fireplace. The fire crackled, casting long, warm shadows across the wooden floor. I opened the thick envelope Arthur had given me. There were 43 letters. I arranged them chronologically on the coffee table. The first one was dated in the spring of 2002, just a few weeks after the custody hearing. The handwriting was shaky, pressed hard into the paper. David, the letter read, "They told the judge I was a monster today. I sat there and watched a man with a shiny watch by my son. I didn't know what to do. I went home and I sat in your empty room and I cried until I couldn't breathe. I don't know if you will ever read this, but you need to know that I fought for you, and I will never stop loving you." I read the next one, and the next. They were not letters full of anger or vengeance. They were the simple, profound chronicles of a father who was forced to love his son from a distance. He wrote about his work. He wrote about building a custom dining table for a client and wishing he could have shown me how to sand the edges perfectly smooth. He wrote about watching a little league baseball game at the park across from his house, wondering if I played sports, wondering if Robert ever showed up to cheer for me. He wrote letters on my birthdays. He wrote letters on my high school graduation day. He wrote a letter the day he read in the local paper that I had passed my CPA exam. "I saw your name in the business section today," the letter from 5 years ago read. "David Kwan, certified public accountant. I know you carry his last name, but the brain in your head, the way you figure things out. That's all you, kid. I'm so damn proud of you. I bought a small cake today and ate a slice for you. I hope you are happy. I hope you are free." I read for 3 hours. The cold, calculating forensic accountant. The man who hadn't shed a tear when his stepfather was hauled away in handcuffs, finally broke. I sat in the quiet cabin and wept. I didn't cry for Robert. I didn't cry for the childhood I lost. I cried because I finally understood the difference between being managed and being loved. Robert had spent millions of dollars on me. He bought me cars, paid for expensive schools, and hosted lavish parties. But every single dollar was an invoice. Every gift was a chain. He managed me to build his own ego. Arthur had nothing. He lived in a small house, drove a beat-up truck, and worked with his hands. But for 24 years, he had sat at his kitchen table and poured pure, unconditional love onto cheap lined paper, asking for absolutely nothing in return. He didn't want gratitude. He just wanted me to exist. I folded the last letter, the one he wrote the week he found out I was getting married, and placed it carefully back into the envelope. I wiped my face, feeling a profound, heavy exhaustion wash out of my bones. The anger, the hypervigilance, the need to constantly calculate every interaction. It was all gone. The audit was truly over. The books were closed. I walked into the bedroom, crawled into bed next to Zoe, and for the first time in my entire life, I fell asleep without analyzing the events of the day. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but when they are fueled by a pristine, irrefutable forensic audit, they crush everything in their path. 6 months after the wedding, Robert's empire was reduced to ash. The FBI investigation triggered an IRS audit, which subsequently triggered a massive SEC investigation into his corporate holdings. When you run a Ponzi scheme built on tax fraud and shell companies, pulling one thread unravels the entire fabric. Robert's accounts were frozen permanently. His logistics firm was seized and liquidated to pay back the millions he owed in back taxes and federal fines. He didn't go to trial. His lawyers, realizing the evidence I provided was bulletproof, advised him to take a plea deal. Robert, the man who had always controlled the narrative, was forced to stand up in federal court and publicly admit that he was a fraud and a thief. The judge, noting the cruelty of the perjury he orchestrated in 2002, showed no leniency. Robert was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He is currently sitting in a medium security facility in Pennsylvania. He has no money, he has no power, and because his assets were seized, he couldn't even afford to hire someone to put money on his commissary account. My mother, Olivia, filed for divorce the day after the arrest, but leaving the sinking ship didn't save her. Because she had signed joint tax returns for 2 decades, she was held liable for a portion of the civil penalties. The massive house in the suburbs was foreclosed on. The diamond tennis bracelets and the luxury cars were repossessed. She moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. She works as a receptionist at a dental clinic now. She calls me sometimes, leaving voicemails, asking if we can meet for coffee. I never pick up. I don't wish her ill, but I have no room in my life for someone who watched me be abused for 24 years and called it peace. I set a firm boundary. No contact. And then there was Caleb. The golden boy's fall from grace was the most spectacular to watch. Without Robert's credit cards, Caleb was entirely helpless. The cryptocurrency market crashed, wiping out whatever remained of the money he had stolen from me. Zoe ensured that my civil suit squeezed every last remaining dime out of his personal accounts to repay my $85,000. For the first time in his 28 years of life, Caleb had to get a job. A mutual acquaintance told me recently that Caleb is working the overnight shift at a fast food drive-thru. He doesn't have a car anymore, he takes the bus. He tried to start a GoFundMe page, claiming he was the victim of a malicious family conspiracy, but no one donated. The illusion was gone. Everyone finally saw him for exactly what he was. A parasite who had lost his host. He tried to text me once. The message read, "David, I'm starving. Can't make rent. Please, you're my brother. You have plenty of money." I didn't block his number. I just read the message, felt absolutely nothing, and deleted it. A ledger must remain balanced. You do not pour clean water into a poisoned well. I got my money back. Zoe and I bought a beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood, far away from the country clubs and the corporate elite. We bought it with our own money, clean and untainted by Robert's conditional generosity. The narcissists were ruined, not by revenge, but by the simple, cold application of the truth. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and all I had to do was turn on the fan. It was a bright Saturday morning in late spring, almost exactly a year after the wedding. I was standing in the driveway of my new house, wearing old jeans and a t-shirt covered in sawdust. The garage door was open, and the smell of cut pine filled the air. Arthur was standing next to me. We were building a new dining room table. Zoe had wanted a massive, farmhouse-style table, and instead of buying one from a high-end catalog, Arthur had offered to teach me how to build it. I watched him run a hand sander along the edge of a massive oak plank. His movements were precise, practiced, and entirely calm. There was no screaming in this garage. There was no manipulation. If I made a mistake and cut a board too short, Arthur didn't lecture me on my failures. He just laughed, handed me another piece of wood, and showed me how to measure it twice. "You're pressing too hard on the left side," Arthur said, turning off the sander and pointing at my work. "Let the paper do the work, David. You don't have to force it." I stopped sanding and wiped the sweat from my forehead. I looked at the wood, then looked at him. "I'm used to forcing things," I admitted quietly. Arthur nodded, understanding the weight behind the words. "I know," he said. "You spent your whole life having to force everything just to survive in that house. But you don't have to do that anymore. The wood doesn't want to fight you. You just have to guide it." I took a deep breath, easing my grip on the tool. I turned it back on and applied a lighter, even pressure. The wood smoothed out beautifully. We don't call each other father and son very often. Feels too heavy, too loaded with 24 years of missing time. We just use our names. But the title doesn't matter. What matters is the quiet, steady presence. What matters is that when my phone rings and I see Arthur's name, my stomach doesn't tie itself in knots. I am 32 years old now. I am a successful forensic accountant. I am happily married to a woman who is my absolute equal. And I am finally truly free. The trauma of being raised by a financial abuser doesn't just disappear overnight. I still catch myself double-checking my bank accounts out of paranoia. I still sometimes tense up when a room gets too quiet, expecting an explosion. But the episodes are getting rarer. The programming is breaking down. When you spend your entire life inside a family that calls control love, you warp your own reality to survive. You start believing that you only have value if you are useful. You start believing that boundaries are selfish, and that suffering in silence is noble. It isn't. It is just suffering. Robert took my childhood. He took my father's savings. He tried to take my future. But in the end, his arrogance gave me the exact tools I needed to destroy him. He turned me into an auditor, and he forgot that auditors always find the missing numbers. Arthur and I carried the finished oak tabletop into the dining room. It was heavy, solid, and built to last a lifetime. We set it down on the iron base, and it fit perfectly. No screws were missing. No edges were uneven. It was completely, perfectly balanced. Zoe walked into the room, holding 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the table, then at me and smiled. "It looks perfect," she said. I looked at Arthur, who was admiring the grain of the wood, and then I looked at my wife. I didn't have to manage anyone's emotions. I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't. I was just David. "Yeah," I said, taking the coffee and pulling Zoe close to me. "It really does." Took me 31 years to realize I was living in a cage. But it only took one morning to break the lock, walk out, and never look back.